Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jo Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to the presentation of the 2021 Lillian Smith Book Awards. A few things before we get started this afternoon. We have enabled live transcriptions for those of you who need that accessibility available to you. You can find the live transcription button by locating the CC button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. Also, after the formal presentation, we welcome, of course, comments and questions for our guests. Please use the Q&A feature. That way we can keep better track of the questions during this part of the presentation. You can find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen. During the presentation, we will also be putting in the chat the ordering links for the books for today's presentation. Karis Books and More is the bookstore that we have selected as the bookseller for this event. They are one of the nation's oldest and longest serving feminist bookstores, and we are so proud to have them here in Decatur, Georgia. We are extremely proud, of course, of all of the independent bookstores we have in the area who have done so much over the past 18 months during the pandemic to make sure that we have the books and supplies that we need. Wherever you are, we encourage you to purchase books from your local independent bookstores as well, especially Black-owned businesses and bookstores, because they are vital to building just communities wherever we are. I would also like to acknowledge the Decatur Book Festival. Of course, the Lillian Smith Book Award is annually presented at the Decatur Book Festival on Sunday afternoon. But once again, the Decatur Book Festival is moving this year. There will be a virtual component, but we will also have a live component on October 2nd at First Baptist Church in Decatur. If you would like to register for those programs, there's a link provided in the chat feature. Click on that, and then that will take you to the Eventbrite pages where you can register for the tickets per each event. Please be reminded that you will be required to wear masks, and you will have to show proof of vaccination or your last negative COVID-19 test to enter First Baptist Church in Decatur. I would like to, of course, acknowledge some of our sponsors of this event as well. The Lillian Smith Center at Piedmont College and its director, Matthew Touch, and Catherine Stein, who is the director of the Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library at UGA. Another one of our sponsors and the man who leads us every year to select these fine, fine books is Charles Johnson. He is a lawyer and the former president of the Gate City Bar Association. He is also the recipient of the Zenith Award presented to him by the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. We are so very pleased to welcome him here this afternoon, and he will introduce the recipients of the awards. Charles?
Good afternoon. I am Charles Johnson, and I'm president of the Southern Regional Council. On behalf of Council and its partners, I want to welcome you to this 53rd annual, second ever virtual presentation of the Lillian Smith Book Awards. Let me begin by providing a little context. In the years right after the Second World War, others were charting a cautious course on racial change, calling for consistently articulated an entirely different vision of a completely desegregated South. And following her death in 1966, the Southern Regional Council established an annual award in her name to recognize authors whose works carry on the tradition of Lillian Smith, work of outstanding literary merit and high moral vision, which honestly portrays the South, its people, its problems, and its promise. And for the last several years, this award has been presented as a partnership between the Southern Regional Council, which established the award, the University of Georgia Libraries, which house the Lillian Smith papers, the Georgia Center for the Book, which presents the Decatur Book Festival, and Piedmont College, which operates the Lillian Smith Center in Clayton, Georgia. There are many people who have had a hand in bringing this event to you and have a hand in bringing it to you every year, but I want to give special recognition to our heroic and distinguished panel of jurors who worked their way through the 46 books that were nominated this year. They include, from the University of Delaware, Minion C.K. Morrison, one of our previous winners. From Tennessee State University, Melvin Johnson. From the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, Merrill Penson. From the Atlanta Fulton Public Library System, James Taylor. And our chair from Clark Atlanta University, Mary Twining Bader. Please join me in thanking our jurors. This year's award recipients are very much in the tradition of our previous honorees. William A. Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American and African Studies, and Economics at Duke University. A. Kirsten Miller is a writer, folklorist, museum consultant, and lecturer whose work focuses on race, art history, and politics. In their book, From Here to Equality, these authors make the most comprehensive case to date for economic reparations for the U.S. descendants of slavery. The book traces the economic inequalities of the 21st century to government decisions after the Civil War, including policies that withheld reparations and compensation from freed Black Americans following the abolition of slavery, as well as the federal government's investments in white Americans during Reconstruction. Through their analysis, Darity and Mullen make the case for modern day reparations. Lawrence Goldstone has written or co-authored well over a dozen books. His articles, reviews, and opinion pieces have appeared in publications: The Atlantic, Salon, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, the Hartford Courant, the New Republic, Tablet, Bloomberg, and the Berkshire Eagle. We honor him today for his book On Account of Race, the Supreme Court, White Supremacy, and the Ravaging of African American Voting Rights. This remarkable book tells the story of an American tragedy, the only occasion in the United States history in which a group of citizens who had been granted the right to vote then had it stripped away. Even more unjust was that this theft of voting rights was done with the full approval, even the sponsorship of the United States Supreme Court. So for those who ask if the 15th Amendment adopted just after the Civil War guaranteed equal voting rights for all citizens, why was there a need for a Voting Rights Act over a century later? For us, the living, the answer set forth in this book provides a strange sense of deja vu. But you've heard enough from me. Let's hear from our honorees. Without further ado, I present to you William A. Darity and Kirsten Mullen.
Thank you so much for the presentation of this spectacular award. We are deeply honored and pleased that From Here to Equality, Reparations of Black American Descendants of U.S. Slavery was selected for the Lillian Smith Award. It's really special, and we are extremely grateful to have been selected. You know, just a little something about, Lillian Smith herself, this tireless champion of racial and social equity, who put her reputation on the line at a time when, few white Southerners were brave enough to do so. We, think about her in the same light as Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who, preceded her. But Smith's personal convictions and not the socially accepted political mores of her time were her North Star. And so we are especially pleased to have this connection to someone so amazing and inspiring. So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about the lost cause. Lost cause narratives as an obstacle to reparations. After winning the Civil War, the Union, in the person of Republican legislatures and their Black allies, wielded significant influence on public policy across the South. They were in the business of funding public schools, creating access to education for all for the first time, not just Blacks, but also, all white children as well, but also involved in rebuilding the infrastructure of the South. This was an opportunity to create a public sector in the South, which had never existed. But all of these advances were sidelined by the lost cause. That argument, that narrative, that spirit completely sidelined all of those efforts but not just the ideology, but the way it was practiced. So not only were they silencing Reconstruction and suppressing the success stories of Reconstruction, the Lost Cause seeded white terror campaigns, which displaced and destroyed Black lives by way of injury and murder. And then we coined this term dismemory to describe the organized and systematic efforts that were made to manipulate and distort the nation's history immediately after the end of the Civil War. This is where we get this whole movement of the erection of thousands of Confederate memorials across the United States by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and most recently, the attempted coup of January 6, 2021. All of these are a through line to the Lost Cause. So why did the war actually take place? Okay. And we talk about this at length in our book From Here to Equality, but the answer is to preserve slavery. So I want to read a bit from some of the comments that the Southerners made, the Southern leaders themselves made in real time. So indeed, in 1861, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, famously connected secession to the maintenance of slavery, an aim he explicitly predicated on a belief in Black inferiority. We reproduce a lengthy portion of Stephens's speech because of its importance. It's raison d'etre for the formation of the Confederacy, but I'm going to read just a portion of his speech. I quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea from the equality of the races. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth," end quote. So then earlier, in an 1858 speech on the floor of the US Senate, James Henry Hammond, who's a Democrat from South Carolina, advanced what he called the, quote, mudsill theory, end quote, declaring that enslaved Blacks were in a position that best suited their place in the natural social order. James Henry Hammond said at the time, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class, which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for this purpose, and we call them slaves," end quote. Hammond's mudsill theory was an elaborate echo of a position taken by the author of an 1865 editorial that was published in the Richmond Inquirer. In a perfectly Orwellian definition of liberty, quote, the editorialist made the following terse statement, designating Blacks to hold a position at the bottom of the American hierarchy to ensure appropriate freedoms for whites. Quote, "In this country alone does perfect equality of civil and social privileges exist among the white population, and it exists solely because we have Black slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery."
In the pages of Forbidden Equality, particularly in Chapter 5, we give a special emphasis to the attempt to persuade the slaveholders throughout the United States to emancipate their human property via a scheme of compensated emancipation. The premise was to pay the slaveholders to free their human property. And if this had occurred on a national scale, it would have made it possible to avoid the Civil War altogether. But the slaveholding class in the United States refused to do that. And when I use the term slaveholding class, as our book demonstrates, that is a wide spectrum of Americans, particularly in the southern states. It's not a small minority by any means. And so their refusal resulted in the Great War that led to a cataclysmic loss of life. Upwards of 700,000 people died during the course of the Civil War. We have had no comparable event that has led to a similar level of deaths of Americans in a similar span of time until the current pandemic. And so the commitment to slavery was so intense that these individuals were willing to engage in an act of traitorship, to secede from the Union, to go to war for the purposes of preserving their right to own human beings. Now, people frequently say in the context of making statements in opposition to the case for reparations that reparations has already been paid by the massive loss of lives that took place during the course of the Civil War. But there's a number of problems with that formulation. The first is the bringing about an end to an atrocity is not the equivalent of compensating the victims of that atrocity for the harms that they have incurred. So stopping a harm is not the same thing as compensating for the effects of the harm. But secondly, the 700,000 deaths count approximately 1/2 or so who were soldiers who were involved in the process of trying to preserve slavery. And then with respect to the Union deaths that took place, we have to recognize that a significant portion of those deaths included the formerly enslaved themselves who sided with the Union and who chose to fight for their own liberation. And so the end of slavery in the United States and the Union victory was not exclusively a consequence of a gift that was handed to Black Americans. Black Americans were heavily involved in the process of eliminating slavery through their own efforts.
So, one of the responses that we hear often to this whole question of, slavery in the South is that, slaveholding was really confined to a tiny elite of white Southerners, that the majority of white Southerners had no connection to slavery whatsoever. And this is absolutely not the case. By 1860, 8% of all American families enslaved at least one Black body. Now, this is at a time when 21% of the non-Southern states had no slavery. So, the picture of what was happening in the North, had no enslaved, slavery was outlawed, in those places.
21 states.
21 states. So the picture in the North and the South are very, very different. But we're sort of speak to, what was happening on the ground in the South. 11 states in the South, at least 20% of white families enslaved Black people, right? So 20 to 29%, you're talking about Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, Louisiana. The remaining 5 of those states, the Southern states, 34% or higher. Now, when you talk about slaveholding families, so before we're talking about households, when you're talking about slaveholding families, 40% of all of the white slaveholders, all the whites in Florida, in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi and South Carolina had a fantastic, 40%. 40% of those households enslaved Black people. But when you look specifically at Mississippi and South Carolina, the number jumps to a fantastic 55% and 57% respectively. So slavery was not an institution that was confined to a tiny elite of Southern whites. And many white Americans across the South were dependent upon slavery for their livelihoods.
Frequently, the argument is made that reparations is not deserved because there was a significant number of Blacks who actually owned human property as well. In a sense, that's actually an irrelevant point because the fact that the atrocity was conducted by some Blacks does not deny the obligation that the nation has, a nation that made slavery legal, the obligation that the nation has to provide compensation for the descendants of those individuals who were damaged and harmed by slavery and unable to transfer resources across the generations to support the living descendants. But in addition, there simply were not very many Black slaveholders in the United States, nor did they hold a significant number or portion of the enslaved population. So we actually relegated this discussion to a footnote in From Here to Equality, but I want to share the content with you. We say the following, excuse me. The best available estimates indicate that 3,000 free Blacks owned 20,000 people in 1860, approximately 0.5% of the 4 million enslaved persons. The 3,000 slaveholding Blacks themselves constituted less than 1% of the 477,000 free Blacks in the United States. So the scale of Black slaveholding was marginal. And frequently people point out that in some instances, Blacks who owned other Blacks had actually purchased their own family members for the purposes of giving them a better life, even though they would technically classify it as enslaved people.
So we're talking next about, slavery being such a long time ago. People say, why are you bringing that up? And we would ask, well, why are we bringing up the Confederacy? And these things were hand in hand. You can't just draw a line and say we're going to talk about one part of history, but not not the other part. And they were inextricably locked and should be linked, these two things.
So the folks who are claiming their Confederate heritage and the like, in the present moment, are talking very much about the events that occurred when slavery took place.
Exactly. But when you think about the generational distance to the period of enslavement, it's not a really long stretch. In my own family, my maternal grandmother, Harriet Taliaferro Mitchell, is the daughter of someone who was enslaved. So, that makes me the third generation in that branch of my family. On my father's side, I am the fourth generation out from slavery. So, it's not really that far. One of the consultants who we quote extensively in From Here to Equality is Hortense McClinton, who is an amazing, 102 years old today, who is the daughter of a slave. Her father, Seabrone King, had been enslaved in Texas, and her family actually had to escape Texas because they were being pursued by whites who were jealous of their intellect, their fortune, and they actually evacuated and moved to a Black town in Oklahoma, to Boley, Oklahoma. So from a generational perspective, slavery wasn't that long ago. But when you also think about, what constitutes this case for slavery, this case for reparations, and for us, it's not slavery solely, but also nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States, which was accompanied by over 100 white massacres. These are situations where, whites, almost always motivated by early, this is during the Reconstruction period when this began, by Black people being actively engaged in politics. And if they weren't able to intimidate Blacks from voting, then they took more serious measures and ran people out of town, sometimes burned the Black community to the ground, and murdered Black people as well. And these were very effective. You scatter the population, and the voting rolls change dramatically, and you've got Black people who then become refugees. But the property that they left behind, what happens to that? And all too often, we're learning that property, which may also have been a major target of the white mobs to begin with, is then appropriated by some of the very same white mobsters who ran those Black families out of town in the first place.
So the final comment we'd like to make in our portion of the program today is to highlight what we think are the four major pillars of what a reparations program ought to look like. And this is detailed in the final chapter of our book, which we think is one of the more unique contributions of the book. It's very unusual for folks who are engaged in the reparations conversation to actually say, here's how you should do it. And that's one of the things that we attempt to do in the book. And there are four attributes that we would say have to be met for an effective reparations program. The first is the proper designation of who should be eligible for reparations. And we argue that individuals who would be eligible would have to meet two standards. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard, and the second is an identity standard. The lineage standard has it that an individual must demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And the identity standard has it that for at least 12 years before the onset of a study commission for reparations or the enactment of a reparations plan, whichever comes first, an individual would have to have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. The second attribute is that a reparations plan must eliminate the racial wealth gap in the United States. Since the disparity in wealth, and we're talking about wealth, not income, wealth being the net value of your personal property, that the differential in wealth between Blacks and whites is the best economic indicator of the cumulative effects over time of the atrocities that we've been talking about, ranging from slavery to legal segregation in the United States, to ongoing discrimination in the United States, as well as the appropriation and seizure of Black-owned property by white terrorists. All of those things play into the existing racial wealth gap, which amounts to approximately $840,000 per household based upon the latest findings from the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances from the Federal Reserve. This means in turn that the bill for reparations would require a payment of at least $11 to $12 trillion for the purposes of erasing this wealth differential. The third feature of an effective reparations plan should be direct payments to eligible recipients, in the same way in which other victimized communities have received direct compensation for the atrocities that they have experienced. Whether we're talking about the German government making direct payments to the victims of the Holocaust, or the US government making direct payments to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II. The final attribute is that the bill must be met by the federal government. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is that the federal government is the party that's capable of doing this, while other institutions in the United States cannot meet a bill of $11 to $12 trillion. So for example, if we were to take the combined budgets of all the state and local governments in the United States, they amount to $3.1 trillion. So they would have to devote their budgets for 4 consecutive years exclusively to a reparations fund to meet the $11 to $12 trillion threshold. And then the second reason is that the federal government is the culpable party. If we think about all of these atrocities that have built into the creation of the racial wealth gap, it's a consequence of policies that have been pursued by the federal government, as well as the legal and authority framework that the federal government has generated. And so this is what we argue a reparations plan ought to look like. And we have invested a significant amount of time in our book talking about the kinds of complaints and arguments that have been lodged against Black reparations, particularly those that have been lodged by the lineal descendants of the lost cause.
You know, Sadie mentioned a bit this question about local reparations. We're seeing, you know, places like Evanston, Illinois, and Burlington, Vermont, Asheville, North Carolina, you know, coming forth and saying that they are putting in place reparations programs. But when you look carefully at each of those initiatives, you see that there's something, they're not reparations at all. I mean, they're not designed to eliminate the racial wealth gap, which, as Sandy said, is, you know, one of the key tenets of any reparations movement from our point of view. You know, they're sort of masquerading as reparations, and we think these are off ramps. These are off ramps reparations and should be called, you know, something like racial equity initiatives, perhaps. But the terminology reparations we feel somewhat proprietary about, and believe it should be reserved for programs that have at their center the elimination of the racial wealth gap for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Derry and Ms. Mullen, for that wonderful presentation. And now for his presentation on Account of Race, Lawrence Goldstein.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for this honor. I was surprised, very much knocked out. I am also honored to share it with Kirsten and William, and who've done great work. And I just think that this is just a wonderful thing to have happened to me in my career, and my profound thanks. As to my work, I choose topics where I feel the past illuminates the present. And I can't think of a more apt example than the period I covered in Account of Race, which, as Charles mentioned, it details the only time in American history to date where a significant group of Americans that had been granted the right to vote then had it taken away. But to fully appreciate the parallel to today's court, it's necessary to look at some of the that were the underpinning of the decisions I wrote about in the book. And those are the principles that dominate in the courts today. So let's start with something simple, the law. People invoke the law a lot, most often in generalities. Well, it's the law, or you have to have laws, or a variety of other things. But it's general because law, while it's an accepted and highly valued concept, it's sort of indistinct. Most people don't have a precise grasp of what the law really means. We believe it's an attempt to get us closer to some system of fairness and fundamental justice, but those ideals are indistinct in their own right as well. So to give practical ballast to these notions, law professors, judges, legal scholars, even your family lawyer, they rely on language. How were these, what were supposed to be these overriding moral principles expressed in the written word? But what happens if we are not using language to illuminate the law, but language itself becomes the law? And that in turn leads us to the current Supreme Court, where a majority of the 9 justices operate under a language-heavy philosophy called originalism or textualism or strict construction. Now, this approach was perhaps best described by former Justice Antonin Scalia in a 1996 speech at Catholic University. He said, I take the words of the Constitution, I take the words as they were promulgated to the people of the United States, and what is the fairly understood meaning of those words? Now, the phrase fairly understood meaning certainly sounds benign enough. And so what Justice Scalia was saying in effect is that constitutional interpretation is not subjective, but can be objectively discerned from the document itself. And of course, Justice Scalia believed that he was exactly the right guy to do all that. But fairly understood meaning turns out to be not nearly as innocent as it sounds. The American Constitution, as every justice actually knows, but almost none of them will admit, is notoriously and often deliberately vague. It was written that way to give the new government the flexibility to rule effectively. For example, Article 1, Section 8, which grants explicit powers to Congress, in that clause, the final clause reads, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Wow, this seems like a really broad power. It seems to say Congress can do pretty much anything it wants without defining any limits. But it seems certain that there must have been some limits, but what are they? How can we discern a fairly understood meaning, an objective meaning of necessary and proper? To give those of you who are parents a simple example, what would be necessary and proper to get a small child to go to bed? Give them sweets, yell, offer to tell a story, let them stay up until they fall asleep on the couch, even hit them. Each of these would be considered necessary and or proper in different households and unnecessary and certainly improper in other households. But difficulties of this sort don't seem to concern, this current crop of objectivist scholars and justices. And they have succeeded in not only setting the tone of American jurisprudence, but also in enabling a conservative movement whose members are privy, they insist, to the Constitution's one and only true meaning. Any judge or justice who disagrees, or even worse, applies a broad notion of fundamental justice is denounced as an activist. A term that these days seems to have taken on a connotation just the side of communist. But who is really the activist? The justice who admits that language itself is a good deal more subjective than the chemical makeup of an amino acid, or the one who insists he or she can say indisputably what an imprecise phrase means? Now, I find this move to certainty to be extremely dangerous. And to get a sense of what happens when self-proclaimed objectivity becomes the accepted norm in American jurisprudence, I began with Reconstruction, when 4 million newly freed slaves were admitted, at least in theory, for the first time as fully fledged members of American society. Now, as you all know, after the Civil War, the United States enacted 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th made everyone born in the United States a citizen, with guaranteed privileges and immunities of citizenship, and guaranteed all persons, regardless of color, due process of law and equal protection of the laws. And the 15th guaranteed that the right to vote would not be infringed because of race. Now, even though there was a strong feeling, at least in the North, that something should be done for these free slaves, the 14th and 15th Amendments were not especially popular. White Americans, even in the North, weren't all that pleased about sharing sovereignty or even citizenship with Black people. The 15th Amendment in particular was not even favored by that small portion of the white ruling class that was committed to equal rights. Granting the right to vote to a population of largely illiterate, not their own fault, socially unsophisticated, also not their own, no fault of their own, former slaves, who might be manipulated into voting for candidates they didn't want, or even their former masters, was a real fear. But there was a quirk in the Constitution that made African-American voting imperative. Under the original Constitution, as you know, only 3/5 of slaves were counted for apportionment. How many seats a state was granted in the House of Representatives and how many votes in the Electoral College. With the passage of the 13th Amendment, however, there would be no more slaves. So these 4 million Black Americans would now be counted in full. And when the 11 Confederate states were allowed back into the Union, which was considered inevitable, if only whites actually voted, they would be doing so for more congressmen and more presidential electors than before the war, by virtue of that 2/5 of Black citizens being counted. White Southerners would then have gained a good deal of power by virtue of losing a war they started to perpetuate human slavery. So guaranteeing the Black vote then became a must, and the 15th Amendment was ratified. Section 1 reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Wow, now that language sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? With a pretty obvious, fairly understood meaning? Well, turns out not so much. Now, the Supreme Court has the power to declare a law unconstitutional and strike it down, but it can't declare a constitutional amendment unconstitutional because it's in the Constitution. So how could Supreme Court justices, if they so desired, overrule these amendments that most people in the country soon realized they didn't want, at least for Black Americans, and these were and the sentiments that the justices shared themselves? Well, Associate Justice Joseph Philo Bradley showed how. In his circuit court opinion in United States versus Cruikshank, in which in 1876, the Supreme Court would eventually free men convicted in the massacre of 150 African Americans in Colfax, Louisiana, Bradley's fairly understood meaning of the 15th Amendment actually contorted the amendment into virtual uselessness. The 15th Amendment, he wrote, confers no right to vote. That is the exclusive prerogative of the states. It does confer a right not to be excluded from voting by reason of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and that is all the right that Congress can enforce. Now, this seems like a simple semantic difference, but Bradley had totally changed both the amendment's meaning and its potential as a tool for the federal government to protect Black voters. He had transferred the burden of proof from the state to demonstrate it had not discriminated to the individual whose right to vote had been denied to demonstrate that it had, and that proved to be virtually impossible. And so, after another series of court decisions which narrowed the impact of the 14th and 15th Amendment, beginning with Mississippi in 1890, every Southern state drafted a new constitution, each of which made no mention of its intention to discriminate while inserting literacy or property qualification or poll tax provisions that would do precisely the same thing. As James K. Vardaman, later to be elected Mississippi's governor and United States senator, observed with his usual delicacy, there is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention of 1890 was held for no other purpose than to eliminate, the N-word from politics. Let the world know it just as it is. And the world did know it, and so did the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. Now, the results were all whites could have hoped for. Voting statistics were kept pretty carefully in Louisiana, and in January of 1897, there were, before Louisiana's new constitution, there were 130,000 Black voters and 164,000 white voters. In March of 1900, after the new constitution was enacted, the number of white voters had dropped to 125,000, but the number of Black voters had gone from 130,000 to 5,000. Now, there were a series of cases that went to the Supreme Court that challenged these new Southern constitutions, but every one was rejected, including the 1903 case of Giles versus Harris, which challenged the 1901 Alabama Constitution, in which the great supposed libertarian Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered an opinion that was an absolute killing blow to African-American suffrage. And with African Americans unable to vote, Jim Crow and decades of oppression was sucked into that vacuum. Now, every one of these decisions that I wrote about in the book were based, according to the justices who wrote these opinions, on a strict reading of the law, the sort of reading that is favored by today's conservative objectivists. And what was the result? 2 amendments to the United States Constitution that were enacted specifically to ensure the equal rights of American citizens of color were prohibited by the Supreme Court of doing that exact thing. Now, it's interesting to me that those who write legal opinions make enormous use of logic, particularly when they're pointing out fallacies in the reasoning of their opponents. But one fallacy that they rarely cite is called the reductio ad absurdum, which deems an argument false even if it otherwise follows the rules of logic, but leads to a conclusion that is impossible or absurd. And to me, the notion that the 14th and 15th Amendment have no role in the protection of African Americans, either in vote or in other forms of civil life, is just that, absurd. So as I said, while the Supreme Court can't declare constitutional amendments unconstitutional, the post-Reconstruction courts did the next best thing. They bent language to their will, they rendered these amendments meaningless, and in effect rewrote these constitutional amendments to suit the racial attitudes of the day and their own. They did not, in the end, render these decisions to conform to the law, but rather contorted the law to conform to their decisions. And in doing so, the justices allowed, mandated, America to become a land of quasi-slavery, to repress African Americans every bit as much as free people as they had been as slaves. So we come back to this basic notion. Is the law merely language, or is it an idea? Is the American Constitution only a series of articles, sections, and clauses, or is it something larger than that? An attempt for the first time in history to devise a government that will guarantee fundamental justice? Will there be times when simply breaking down the language to try to come to a definition will defeat that goal of equal justice for all? The Constitution was flawed, obviously it's been amended for 2 centuries, but was that better to define language or better to define justice? Now, I'm in no way saying that language and logic have no place in law. They are necessary tools, but tools have limited utility. They must be used for the purpose for which they were designed. If they are employed otherwise, there is every possibility that they can destroy the very thing that they were supposed to help create. And I wrote Account of Race to illuminate these ideas and to give people a sense of how these tools were misused in the past and essentially being misused in the present.
So thank you so much, Lawrence. And once again, thank you again, Kirsten and William, for your book as well. If any of you now at this time have any questions for our guests, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section, or if it's more convenient, feel free to type it into the chat section and we can get them from there. And I just want to let you know right now that, of course, several folks have chimed in and said that it's powerful and compelling information and how important these books are for us both to have. Very quickly, Lawrence, speaking of the Constitution and the language of the Constitution, I remember that when Bill Clinton was president, he always called the Constitution a living document. But it seems that in the past 20 years, give or take, that at least the way it's looking now is that most Americans are very hesitant to try and amend the Constitution or have the government make laws that may challenge aspects of the Constitution. What do you think accounts for this kind of change of we went through a period of, Voting Rights Act and the Women's Rights Act changing the Constitution, but, now we're less inclined to do so, even though we may really have a need for it?
Well, Bill Clinton did refer to the Constitution as a living document, but Justice Scalia famously referred to the document. He said he believes in a dead Constitution. That is, it means what it meant back then, which didn't stop him from violating all his own rules in DC v. Heller, which was the gun control case. I think the problem with amending the Constitution, it was made intentionally difficult. 3/4 of state legislatures, 2/3 of each House of Congress. And we are now in a position. One of the things that people don't realize about the Constitution was that it was created to institutionalize minority rule. The Constitution was not created to have a rule by a majority, but rule by a minority. And when it was enacted, a very small minority. So things that would broaden the reach, things that would broaden the democratic aspects of the Constitution were made intentionally difficult. And now we have the way the country is divided, small states, when you need 3/4 of the state legislatures, there won't be 3/4 of the state legislatures, that would vote for just about anything right now. If you said, do you like ice cream? And the Democrats proposed that, the Republicans would say, no, ice cream is bad for you, and vice versa. So we are in this unfortunate place that people are not thinking in terms of public policy as will it help or hurt the country as a whole, but is it what my group favors? Will it erode the power that this group that I belong to has? I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's my sense of things.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer. Kirsten, William, during your lecture, you made reference to, of course, the lost cause narrative and how this was propped up and promulgated by the Daughters of the Confederacy. Here in Decatur, Georgia, we recently had a monument taken down on Decatur Square that was erected to the lost cause, and the city is now working to make a monument, hopefully, of the late Congressman John Lewis to replace it. What I'm interested in is that, and we had several books this year as well on Confederate monuments. How does that play into reparations, and how does that still lingering lost cause narrative and the promulgation of that as well set us back, not only in reparations, but in moving the Black Lives Matter movement forward and other movements forward to really rewrite the wrongs of this kind of history?
Part of the difficulty in the US is that we did not treat the Confederates as the losers in the Civil War. Ordinarily, one would not have been allowed to place your officers in contention for public office, which is exactly what happened here. The losses that they sustained as a consequence of government policy were all reversed. The land that they had abandoned and that was confiscated from them because they were traitors to the Union was ultimately returned to them. This is land that had been designated for the newly emancipated enslaved people, the 40 acres and a mule that we have been brought up as part of our history. But they were not. They were handled with kid gloves. Much of the research that we have found indicates that the Southerners were prepared to take their lumps. They assumed that they would have to step back, that they would have to accept co-governing with Blacks, that Black men would be allowed to vote, that the political terrain was going to look different than it had. But Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson steps in, and he reverses all of these things. At one point, one of the Democrats was saying, we were amazed to look up and discover that we are given opportunities we never dreamed of, by Andrew Johnson and his allies. So this was an incredible moment that could have been pregnant with possibility. And in fact, we were on the ground, changes were already happening. Changes were already occurring in many cities across the South. But by the end of the year, certainly the, placing Black families on these 40-acre land grants had ended. So, we have this picture of what might have been. But when you let, Confederate officers run for office and allow them, Confederate members of the Confederacy to vote and simultaneously disenfranchise, the Black Republicans, well, you're going to have a very different kind of outcome. So, the question for me would be, what really were white Americans, North and South, thinking? Because the Southerners could not have put this reversal in place if Northerners had not been complicit. Yeah.
Oops, sorry. Still happens even though we've been at this for 18 months now. While I have you both on here, I have a question from Meryl, and it applies to, of course, all of you, but this kind of seems very timely with the both of you on screen right now. It's like, have you found that your books have been used by Congress or policymakers to help with infrastructure conversations or voting rights legislation or the Commission on the Courts? What do you see as the immediate or longer term future of your ideas?
Want me to go first? If any policymakers who have been using my book have not yet told me, I certainly hope so. You know, you want to get these ideas out. I think they're fundamental. In terms of the longer term future of the ideas, it's part of a process. I do not expect, nor does anyone here expect all of a sudden people to say, oh, yes, we have been acting so unjustly, we're going to change our ways and start doing things totally differently. But what I want to do, and I think what William and Kirsten want to do, is you get things into the conversation. You get these ideas. You're planting seeds. You want to create an atmosphere where people accept these as part of the possibilities. And in my case, they would say, yes, this happened in the past. We don't want this to happen now. This is, you know, we are repeating. And you know, what impressed me about William and Kirsten's presentation, they're in the same place. Yes, this is history in the present. And that's what you want. You just want to get people thinking, get people talking, be part of a process of change, which may take a really, really long time, and we might not be here for it, but you want to be part of it. And that's why I do it.
Yeah. So in our case, the Mystic Valley branch of the NAACP actually provided a copy of our book for every member of Congress, which of course leaves open the question as to whether or not any members of Congress have read the book. But we do know that in some instances, some of their staff members have looked at the book and have made connections with us for a handful of conversations. I guess the most recent one was probably with Representative Kathy Clark. And it was a very thoughtful and generous conversation. But we don't think that the genuine momentum for reparations is going to come from the existing Congress. That it's going to have to be a product of political pressure that comes from the American population writ large. And I think that there's some grounds for optimism. I don't know if you want to talk about how the American opinion appears to have changed.
Yes. You know, 20 years ago, only 4% of white Americans were advocates of reparations for Black Americans in this country. 16 years later, the number had jumped to about 16%, so 1% or so per year. And then presently, the number is over 30% in favor of reparations for Black Americans, with a majority of younger white Americans in favor. So the trend is moving in the right direction. Now, whether it will continue to do so, it's anyone's guess. But we've not seen a sustained conversation like this, which I would say publicly began in the US in January 2019, when then presidential candidate Marianne Williamson advocated for some form of reparations that would be paid to Black Americans by the federal government. I mean, she basically, her making that part of her platform probably led to Julian Castro and Tom Steyer saying that they too supported some kind of wealth redistribution. Now, they were not very specific about what they meant by that. But, that was unprecedented, in our lifetimes to see, on televised debate the reparations actually, came up. So, I mean, we are, hopeful. We're finding, that this is a topic that many politicians were just terrified to speak on. Now, what you're seeing now, though, is a little crazy in that what, the word reparations is coming out of a lot of people's mouths, but what they mean by that is highly, highly variable. As we said earlier, a lot of what we're hearing people call reparations are racial equity initiatives or acts of atonement, things that cities and states should have been doing all along if they were, serving all of their citizens. And so those kinds of initiatives should not be confused with reparations, but the conversation is continuing. And, I think it's a very positive thing.
Excellent, thank you so much. And that kind of answers one of the jurors' questions as well, Melvin. We saw that in the chat. And Beverly, I just want to say, I did see your question. Feel free to go ahead and email us through Eventbrite, and we'll see if we can make a connection for you there as well. But another question from Mason came in and said, are there ways that people are currently using constitutionality or unconstitutionality, and in particular originalism, to bolster arguments against reparations?
It hasn't really come up as a legal issue. There is nothing in the Constitution that would prevent reparations. In one of the other principles of the Constitution was that if it isn't said specifically, it's left to the judgment of the state or the people. In fact, the 10th Amendment, when a lot of people in the country during the ratification process thought that wasn't strong enough, the 10th Amendment to the part of the Bill of Rights was that anything not specifically assigned to the federal government is left to the states and the people. So the originalism I don't think would play any role in whether or not a reparations lawsuit, if reparations were enacted and someone challenged it, I don't see how even an originalist court could delve into the Constitution and say, no, the language prohibits it. But the trick, of course, is to get reparations passed and then get to the point where it gets to the court. And I have to say, with this court, after the Texas abortion case, where in effect, the court okayed a law that could have come out of Stalinist Russia, where you're asked to inform, you're encouraged to inform on your neighbors. Who knows? But from a constitutional standpoint, reparations, to me, would have no problem.
Well, I would say we certainly saw some parallels to the Fugitive Slave Acts in the United States, where Americans were, on penalty of law and fines and public whippings, instructed to inform on their neighbors and to turn in people who they perceive to be, with or without evidence, runaway slaves. So not or people who are hiding runaway slaves. So not colonist Russia, per se, but right here.
Actually, I have an interesting follow-up to that from another.
Well, let me just mention, it's interesting that there's been a number of instances of reparations that actually have been paid. And to the extent that we're aware, there's been no significant court challenge against those particular instances. So if there was a court challenge in the case of reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery, it would be a product purely of outright American racism. Because reparations have been paid to Japanese Americans for being unjustly incarcerated during World War II. Reparations have been paid to families who lost loved ones during the course of the 9/11 attacks. Reparations have recently been paid to the individuals who were subjected to captivity in Iran during the Carter presidency. And so you know, it would be a very interesting and convoluted argument that would have to be made to direct a case against reparations that were specifically for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, which is not to say that that convoluted case won't, but there it is.
The reparations paid to the internment, to the Japanese Americans who were interned, that was an interesting case. It came more than 10 years afterwards, and it represented, there was a shift in the national consciousness as to Asian Americans, not full acceptance certainly, but there was the immigration laws had been passed. So what you had there was a political mood that made those reparations more, and there wasn't that much money, but the political mood made the passing of reparations, the enacting of reparations, much more acceptable. So I think that that's a function also, because the court certainly would not have struck that down.
Well, 2 points, 2 quick points. One, it was about 40 years between the period of incarceration and when Japanese Americans received reparations, like 1988.
Right, yes.
And they were incarcerated during World War II. But the other point I wanted to make about that is, it's just go out of my head, that, so that same survey that I mentioned, this is the one that took place 20 years ago. This was Popoff and Dawson's survey, also asked Americans if Japanese Americans should be compensated for their internment. And the majority said no, when in fact it had already happened.
Yeah, and Popoff and Dawson say that they don't think that the respondents knew that.
Yeah, people aren't aware that happened.
Yeah.
And I don't think that many Americans are aware that the Americans who were held hostage in Iran received basically $10,000 per day of their captivity. So on average, each of them received $4.4 million in reparations. Japanese Americans received $20,000 total for, some of them 4.5 years of incarceration by their own government. So in a case where the US government was not even the perpetrator, they allocated, now it wasn't an easy, an easy decision. It took some years for that to take place, but for what was the total? Over not quite 2,000 people.
Oh, you're talking about the Iran Huskies?
Yes.
Oh, no, it's
but yeah, but
it was no. 100.
I don't have that.
It was relatively,
but
it was 100 people
the amount,
for 400 days or something like that.
Say that again.
I think it was 100 some people for more than 400 days.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
that's right.
That's about right. Anyway, but we don't really know. It's interesting what Americans do and don't pay attention to.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting one that kind of follows up to all that we've been talking about from Richard, and he asks, is there a way to move law out of politics? How does one protect law and the issues of justice from partisan politics, left or right? Is there a structure that can, at least in design and or in theory, make the law harder to be manipulated by partisan politics?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Tocqueville way back when said, if you want to corrupt the law, get a lawyer. I think it will be extraordinarily difficult you can't eliminate language from law. So that's off the table. I think it will be extremely difficult to create a legal structure that isn't interpretive. And once it's interpretive, then you're introducing the political. The essential theme of my work is that the Supreme Court's the third political branch of government. And I think you have to deal with it as a political branch of government. So it's not the structure of the laws, I think, well, what we need is term limits for justices. So, you know, we can get younger justices, so you don't have to be, you know, 23 years old to be appointed to the court. You can get an older scholar or judge. And I think you have to have a redefinition of what the court's powers are. I wrote another book on judicial review, which is totally bogus, made up by John Marshall and Marbury versus Madison. It is not in the Constitution. It was not meant to be in the Constitution. And here you have this enormous power that the court has. So I think that's the trick, is to find ways to redefine the Supreme Court, how you staff it, how long they stay, and what its powers are.
Kirsten, William, any thoughts on that particular question?
I mean, we would agree.
I think there's a potentially perverse response, which is if you were to eliminate partisan politics, you probably would have to establish an authoritarian regime that necessarily extinguished an opposition. I mean, partisanship is part and parcel of having what we think of as a democracy in some sense. So I'm not sure we want to divorce things from partisan politics. We just have to be very cognizant of which side of the fence is the one that we're supporting and endorsing.
You know, the thing about democracy is an unforgiving system. If you don't participate, you stay home. The other guys get to make the rules. Right. And what we have, the irony is that you will have any number of issues, gun control, freedom of choice, where the majority have a strong belief in one direction and the law is in another direction. And one of the reasons that this can continue to be perpetrated is that people stay home. They don't vote. And in 2010, for example, when the conservatives took over all these state legislatures, they took over state legislatures in states where Democrats, people on the left, had a majority. So in the end, I mean, William said it's exactly right. You need partisan politics, but you can't take the process for granted. If you don't participate, and that's the other thing when I give a talk, I say, look, if you don't participate, don't complain. You know, it is our responsibility to be part of a process that we want to move in one direction or another.
So, got one last question for you all coming in from Jemiah. And she asks, have surveys evaluated if Americans feel that a wrong was done and perpetuate still to support our collective support as a nation for forward consideration for reparations? Does America believe slave descendants were wronged or not really? She says that she gets the sense that many feel the outcome of the Civil War was the reparations. Is it false? Is it a false narrative? But that is what has been taught in the school systems in America.
We'd like to emphasize, you know, that the ending of an atrocity is not the same thing as compensating for the harm. You know, there's the quote that we like to use of Malcolm X's. You know, he said, if you stabbed a person, you know, and plunge the knife 9 inches into their body, and you pull it out 3 inches, that provides a little bit of relief, but the knife is still 6 inches in the body. Then you pull it out another 3 and another 3. And even after the knife has been completely withdrawn, you still have this gaping wound. And so we would say that all of these programs that cities and states and some communities of faith, some cultural institutions and colleges and universities are putting forth would be pulling the knife out, you know, the equivalent of the 3 inches or the 6 inches. You know, these are strategies that will provide relief, hopefully, and also goodwill, and moving in the direction of, you know, a society of equals. But the debt is still there, and the debt still needs to be paid. You know, if I've been stealing your cattle for 5 years, and you finally, you know, threaten me And I said, all right, I'm sorry, I'll stop stealing your cattle, but I still have them. I won't take any more, but I still am going to hold on to the 400 I've already stolen. That debt needs to be paid, and with interest, many would say. And so that's what we're talking about, is this debt that's healing the wound. This is the debt that the federal government owes, because the federal government is the party that put these laws into place that made it possible for Black Americans to be disadvantaged in this country, that made it possible for white Americans to have wealth creation, and simultaneously Black Americans have sort of just the opposite, kind of the diminution of wealth creation. At the same time that Black Americans were promised these 40-acre land grants, white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, were promised and did receive 160-acre land grants, the Homestead Acts. This was land that was in the Western Territories, which basically completed the country's colonial settler project. Lands that had just very recently been occupied by indigenous peoples who were either forced to move to reservations or annihilated. Those were the basic options. And this is land that, they could live on the land, they could sublease it, you could divide it, sell portions of it. Any lumber, any livestock on the land was yours to use or to sell as you saw fit. But most importantly, you could bequeath those assets, the profits themselves and the land itself, to your offspring. And we know that wealth is the best indicator in this country of the cumulative effects of generations of racism in this country, white supremacy. White Americans had this opportunity to pass on wealth, starting at least as early as 1862, and Black Americans did not. We're talking about 270 million acres of land that was handed out, basically the dole, free equity from the government. That's equivalent of all of Texas and all of California combined. We're not talking about a trivial amount of land. Some 1.5 million land grants were made, and that translates to 45 million whites today, white households, who are still reaping the benefit of that single federal policy. In one extraordinary example, one of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, learned from one of her students. So she had her students, interrogate their own family's wealth positions. And this is at Texas A&M, class of about 150 students, 12 or 13 of them, I think, identified as Black, another 38 or so as of color, but 100 as white. Fully a quarter of the white students found a Homestead Act in their families' histories. Zero Black students, zero students of color found them. And almost the majority of the whites found GI Bills. This was benefits that enabled their ancestors to purchase homes. And the GI Bills showed up in the families of white immigrants, not just families that had been here, since the 1800s. And in one extraordinary case, a family that had received a land grant in the panhandle of Texas, and these are the grandchildren who were reporting on this. There are 8 children. The patriarch dies, and his widow moves with the 8 children to Austin to give them a greater likelihood of going to college. 6 of the 8 get a college degree, emerge debt-free as a consequence of the flow of funds that she had. She and her husband initially had elected to lease the land and to receive an income stream from that property. After the patriarch dies, his widow continues to lease it. Then when she dies, the 8 children decide to continue the lease. So basically they're receiving a revenue stream, from the federal government. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after the patent was made, natural gas is discovered on the land. And it turns out to be the largest such deposit in that area. And in the first year alone, the revenues were over $100,000. So, the descendants continue to divide the proceeds, the profits 8 ways. But it's like getting a monthly dividend check from the federal government. And we're not saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. We think that the federal government should help its citizens, but it should help all of them, not just a select group of citizens. But that was a tremendous boost that white Americans received that Black Americans did not. I mean, it was bad enough that it was set up as 40 acres for Blacks versus 160 for whites, and then the Blacks get nothing. Yeah.
I just quickly want to address the last part of that question about what's taught in schools. Yeah, there are a lot of false narratives taught in the American school system, and they're getting falser. And that, if you think about it, if our hope is coming generations and we are feeding them mythology and avoiding, what the role is, you can have honest debate, but what you cannot do is exclude certain points of view and exclude certain narratives simply because you have decided that American exception, we all know what the arguments are. And so what disturbs me is that if we want real change and we are not educating our children in the past, they are unlikely to see as great a need to change their present and future as we want them to. So what is going on in the schools today is really disturbing to me.
Well, Lawrence, Kirsten, William, thank you all so very much for this lecture. I'm absolutely thrilled that we were able to get together today virtually to do this. I am sure that if we were at the book festival and this was at the library, we'd be struggling to get the next act on stage, because this is a barn burner of a conversation that I am sure no one would have wanted to leave until the last possible second. Allie has put, of course, the order links back in the chat for you all. And if you order from Karis Books, this is just an example, last year's winner, but on account of race and Kirsten and William's book are on display at the library. So I don't have them here for this afternoon, but if you order them from Karis Books, they will come with the wonderful gold Lillian Smith Award sticker that was also created to go along with the Lillian Smith Book Award. Once again, thank you all, to the judges, to the committee, to all of you participants who have joined us here on this Sunday afternoon for Labor Day weekend. We will, of course, be moving a little later in the near year next year, but we hope you will join us as well. Once again, congratulations to all of the winners, and thank you so much for allowing us to bring this into your homes this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Have a safe and happy Labor Day weekend, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.